I woke up to the sound of laughter, sharp echoing wrong, the kind that doesn't belong inside your dream home. For a split second I thought I was still asleep, but then came the splash, then another, then music. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and pulled open the curtains and froze. 3 women were in my backyard pool, not beside it, in it, floating on swan inflatables, sipping drinks, their Bluetooth speaker blasting pop music loud enough to shake the fence. One of them waved like I was the intruder. My dream home, the one I'd worked 20 years to afford, had turned into a public water park overnight. And in the middle of it all sat one woman in a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, the kind of confidence only a lifetime of entitlement could buy. That was the day I met Karen, and she decided my pool was hers. Before we dive deeper, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is, and don't forget to subscribe. You'll want to see how this story ends. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, staring at the absurd scene my backyard turned into some kind of suburban pool club. The morning sun hit the water just right, glimmering off their sunglasses and plastic cups, and for a surreal moment, I wondered if I was in the wrong house. Maybe I'd broken into someone else's dream. But then I glanced at the deed framed on the kitchen counter. Nope, this was mine. Every square foot of it. I stepped outside, trying to sound calm, but all 3 heads turned toward me. The one in the big sun hat, the ringleader, slowly raised her sunglasses, peering over the rim like a queen inspecting her servant. "Your pool," she said with a laugh that felt like nails on glass. "Sweetheart, this is the community pool. You must be nay." "Community pool?" I blinked. "No, it's not. I bought this property 2 months ago. This pool sits on my land. I paid for it. You're trespassing." The other 2 women glanced at each other awkwardly, but the sun hat lady just smirked. She had that tone, that HOA authority voice that can turn even the calmest neighbor into a villain. "I wasn't notified about any sale," she said, lounging back in the water like she was reclining on a throne. "And I have a key. So unless you're squatting here, I'd suggest you call." Her arrogance hit me like chlorine in the eyes. "Your key? That's impossible. The locks were changed." She shrugged, unfazed. "Oh, you must be talking about that gate. The side one." I had no idea what Section 9 meant, but I did know one thing: she was lying. I'd read every page of the homeowner's deed before signing it. The pool, the deck, the surrounding patio, all part of the private lot. Still, the way she said it made me second-guess myself. Her confidence was unsettling, like she'd been doing this for years and getting away with it every time. "Ma'am," I said, trying to stay polite, "you need to leave. Right now." Her smile widened. She stood up slowly, water dripping from her arms sliding down the hem of her floral swimsuit cover-up. She walked toward me, wet footprints marking the deck, stopping just close enough for me to catch the scent of expensive sunscreen. "Tell you what," she said softly, tilting her head. "Why don't you call the HOA president, ask him? His name's Paul. Tell him Karen said hi." That name, Karen, it fit her too perfectly. I didn't even need to hear the rest. She gave me one last condescending smile, flicked her wet hair over her shoulder, and whispered, "We'll see who really owns this pool." Then she turned, gestured for her friends, and they all climbed out as if they were doing me a favor. As they left through the side gate, I noticed something strange. She didn't struggle with the latch. The gate opened smoothly, no resistance. She had a key. I locked the gate behind them, checked it twice, and stood by the pool in silence. The water rippled lazily, reflecting the morning sun mocking me. It should have been peaceful. Instead, I felt invaded, exposed. My perfect home had been tainted by something worse than vandals' entitlement. That evening I met Paul, the HOA president, at his office near the clubhouse. He was friendly enough at first, polished, rehearsed, smile, the kind of man who says, "neighbor" too often. I told him what happened, showed him a screenshot of Karen and her friends in the pool. He looked at the photo, then at me, then laughed nervously. "Oh, Karen, yeah, she's spirited. Look, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. You know how these things go. We all share amenities here." I frowned. "This isn't an amenity. It's part of my property line." He sighed, pretending to read something on his laptop. "Right. But she's been a resident here for over 15 years. We can't just assume malicious intent. Maybe you could extend a little goodwill." "Goodwill," I repeated, incredulous. "She broke into my pool. Let's not use words like broke in." He leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were co-conspirators. "She's a respected member of the HOA board. Making enemies this early won't do you any favors." I stared at him. "Are you saying I should let people trespass on my land because it's inconvenient to upset her?" He smiled thinly. "I'm saying, pick your battles." That phrase stuck with me the whole drive home. Pick your battles. It sounded wise until you realized it always benefits the aggressor. When I got back, the gate was locked, or so I thought. Out of habit, I tested it. Click. It opened again. The latch had been filed down, not broken, not forced, altered. Someone had deliberately shaved the metal so it wouldn't close properly. That's when the reality sank in. Karen wasn't bluffing. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was claiming territory. I tightened the lock with a new padlock, double-checked every latch, and ordered 4 outdoor cameras that night. I spent the next weekend installing them, 1 by the pool, 1 near the gate, 2 along the fence line. Each had motion detection and remote access. For a few days, nothing happened. The footage was empty except for squirrels, birds, and the occasional leaf blowing by. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then on Tuesday, around noon, while I was at work, I got a motion alert. I opened the camera feed, and there she was, Karen, alone. Reclining on my pool chair, sun hat tilted perfectly, holding a cold drink like she was posing for a magazine. She didn't even swim. She just sat there for 2 hours, scrolling her phone occasionally, taking selfies. The next day, same thing. Then Thursday, she brought 2 friends again. They swam, they ate sandwiches, they left before I got home. By Friday, it wasn't just disrespect, it was performance. Like she knew I was watching. That weekend, I marched back to the HOA office. Paul wasn't there, but his assistant told me, "Oh, Karen's using the pool again. She mentioned something about community access. Didn't you two settle that?" Settle that? My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. I showed her the video feed, Karen splashing, laughing, raising her drink to the camera like she was toasting me. The assistant's smile faltered. "Oh, wow. Okay, I'll make a note for the next board meeting." "Don't bother," I said coldly. "I'll handle it myself." That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, the deed, the plat map, the HOA guidelines. Every line proved the same thing: the pool was mine. But proof didn't matter to people like Karen. They didn't believe in rules, only reactions. I poured myself a drink, stared out at the still water reflecting the moonlight, and whispered to no one, "You picked the wrong pool, Karen." Because in that moment, something inside me clicked. Not anger, resolve. I wasn't going to beg the HOA call the cops or argue with her anymore. I was going to plan. And if there's one thing I'd learned from years of managing stubborn people, it's that the best revenge doesn't shout. It waits. The next morning, I opened my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at a name I hadn't dialed in years: Dr. Mason, chemistry department. A slow smile spread across my face. If Karen wanted to keep swimming in my pool, I'd make sure she'd never forget it. The first thing I did that weekend was turn my backyard into Fort Knox. I installed a new locking mechanism on the gate, industrial-grade stainless steel, the kind you'd need a saw to break through. I even added a bright yellow sign that screamed "Private Property," "No Trespassing" in bold black letters. It looked more like a construction site than a home pool, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let some over-tanned HOA dictator turn my life into a neighborhood circus. For the first few days, peace returned. The water was still, my coffee tasted better, and I actually started sleeping again. I checked my cameras obsessively, but nothing, no motion alerts, no strange noises, just quiet mornings and the gentle hum of sprinklers. Then Wednesday arrived. I was at work finishing up a late meeting when my phone buzzed. Motion detected backyard camera. I froze. My heart sank before I even opened the app. And sure enough, there she was, Karen strutting through my gate like she owned the place. The new lock was hanging open. She didn't break it. She unlocked it. Somehow she had another key. Karen laid her towel across my lounge chair, adjusted her sun hat, and lay back with a smug expression. She stayed for nearly an hour occasionally, scrolling her phone occasionally, looking straight into the camera and waving. It wasn't defiance anymore. It was domination. That night, I replayed the footage over and over. Every frame of her soaking in my sunlight made my skin crawl. I checked the timestamps, the angles, even the reflections in the pool glass. She knew exactly where my cameras were. By Friday, she wasn't alone anymore. She brought 2 friends, one blonde, one brunette. They came armed with snacks, matching towels, and a pink inflatable flamingo. They laughed, toasted each other with cans of seltzer, and dove in like it was their resort. The gall of it made my jaw tighten. On Sunday, I caught something new, a maintenance guy walking in through the side gate. He carried a pool net, started skimming the surface, and waved toward the camera as if this was all routine. I stepped outside immediately. "Hey," I called out. "What are you doing here?" He blinked, startled. Miss Karen said she's the owner. Asked me to clean weekly." I nearly laughed. "You're fired." And tell Miss Karen if she steps on my property again, she'll need more than a net." The poor kid just nodded and hurried off. That was the breaking point. I gathered every piece of evidence, screenshots, video files, timestamps, and marched to the HOA office first thing Monday. Paul, the president, greeted me with that same syrupy smile. "Ah, good morning, neighbor. Everything all right, no, Paul?" "It's not all right," I said, slapping a USB stick on his desk. "Karen's been trespassing all week. She's bringing guests. She even hired a pool cleaner to service my private property." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand you're frustrated, but don't," I interrupted. "Don't give me another HOA speech about harmony and goodwill. Watch the footage." He reluctantly plugged in the drive and clicked play. Karen's smug face filled the monitor, lounging by the pool, waving at the camera. Paul leaned back. "Okay, that doesn't look great." "Doesn't look great," I said, incredulous. "It's illegal. She's trespassing. That's a criminal act." He hesitated, shifting in his chair. "Look, between you and me, Karen's influential. She's on the budget committee. If I take disciplinary action, she could call for a recall vote. I can't afford another HOA war right now." There it was, the truth, plain and rotten. The system wasn't built for justice, it was built for convenience. "So you're not going to do anything," I said flatly. "I'll send her a warning letter," he said quickly, eyes darting away. "That's the best I can do without a board meeting." I laughed. "Right, a letter. I'm sure that'll terrify her." He tried to soften his tone. "You have to understand, Karen's been here for 15 years. You're new. These things take time to settle." I leaned forward. "Time. She's been swimming in my pool." "How much more time do you need before it becomes a community park?" He said nothing, just tapped his pen nervously. When I left the office, I realized something profound. Nobody was coming to help me. Not the HOA, not the neighbors, not the police, who'd probably laugh it off as a civil matter. That evening, I watched the sunset from my deck. It should have been peaceful, but all I could feel was anger simmering under my skin. My property, my sanctuary, had become a joke. Later that night, I reviewed old camera footage, hoping for clues, and I found one. 2 weeks earlier, the footage showed Karen slipping through the gate with a set of keys in hand. I zoomed in, silver keychain, bright pink tag with her initials KP. She didn't just have a spare key, she had the original. The previous homeowner must have given her one for access years ago, back when she was managing the community pool maintenance. That explained everything. The audacity, the confidence. She wasn't guessing, she was reclaiming what she thought was still hers. At midnight, I called my locksmith, an old friend named Ray. He owed me a favor from a project years ago. "Ray, I need new locks. All of them. Tomorrow." He whistled. "All right, tough guy. What's going on? You running from the mob?" "Worse," I said. "An HOA Karen." He laughed. "Say no more. I'll be there at 9. By noon the next day, every lock was changed. Gate, side, door shed, even the mailbox. I handed Ray a coffee and told him to keep the spares off record. He winked. "Don't worry, man. She's not getting through these." But Karen was nothing if not persistent. By Thursday, I got another motion alert. My stomach dropped. I opened the live feed, and there she was again. Standing outside the locked gate, holding a tote bag and a look of pure indignation. She shook the latch violently, muttering something I couldn't hear. Then she leaned closer to the camera and said, clear as day, "You can't lock me out forever." The nerve of this woman was beyond human comprehension. That night I sat in the dark watching that clip on repeat. Her words echoed in my head over and over. "You can't lock me out forever." It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. I started noticing things. My mailbox left open, footprints near the gate, a towel draped over the fence one morning. She was still getting in somehow, maybe jumping the fence, maybe through a weak spot in the corner I hadn't reinforced. It was psychological warfare now. Every creak of wood, every motion alert made my pulse spike. She wanted to wear me down, make me snap first. But that's the thing about people like Karen, they mistake patience for weakness. On Sunday, I hosted a small barbecue with a couple of coworkers. They'd heard the story and thought I was exaggerating. Until halfway through lunch, one of them pointed at the camera feed on my phone. Dude, is that her?" Sure enough, there she was again, walking through my yard, like she was on her way to her personal spa. I slammed my drink down and marched outside. "Karen," I yelled. She turned unbothered. "Oh, hi," she said cheerfully. "Just checking the water levels." "HOA business. Get out." Her smile froze. "Excuse me, you heard me. This isn't HOA property. It's mine. You step foot here again and I'll file trespassing charges." She laughed. Oh, please. You think anyone's going to believe you over me? This neighborhood runs on my word. Then maybe it's time someone changes that, I said. Her eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You'll regret this. You don't understand how things work here. I understand perfectly, I said. And I'm done playing nice. She smirked. We'll see. Then she turned and left, dripping arrogance with every step. I watched her walk away, fists clenched. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about control. She wanted to own me, my peace, my patience, my dignity. That's when I decided. No more cameras, no more signs, no more warnings. If Karen wanted to keep playing games, fine. I'd play too, but I'd play smarter. Because from that night on, I wasn't defending my property anymore. I was preparing for war. By the time Monday rolled around, the rage had cooled into something colder and more methodical, a plan. Angry shouting felt primitive. Paperwork had failed me. The HOA had failed me. Public shaming hadn't even begun. What I needed was a move that would do three things at once: expose Karen, protect my property, and make sure the whole neighborhood saw who had been lying all along. I scrolled through my phone until I found an old contact I hadn't dialed in years. Mason Alder, PhD, chemistry professor, grad school roommate, the kind of guy who could make a bad idea look like a brilliant thought experiment. We drank cheap beer at midnight and wrote equations on napkins back in the day. If anyone could help me design something safe but memorable, Mason was the one. Hey Mason, I said when he answered. You remember your old stubborn friend from the dorm? There was a long amused pause. How could I forget? What have you gotten yourself into this time? I told him the story fast and clipped the purchase the first night. The sun hat, the key, the HOA president with his rehearsed smile, the footage of her lounging like she'd moved in. When I got to the part about her brand of sunscreen, the stuff she rubbed on like it was perfume, Mason chimed in. High SPF, titanium dioxide. That's her thing, right? He sounded both interested and cautious. Listen, I don't mix anything for stunts anymore, but I have access to harmless reagents and commercially approved colorants. If your goal is humiliation and documentary proof, not harm, there are ways to make a visible reaction that's temporary and skin-safe. Think theatrical dye more than chemistry experiment. Don't do anything that could be toxic or dangerous. Relief flooded me. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I wanted a spectacle, a theatrical unmasking, legal non-toxic reversible, I repeated. Something that reacts specifically with her sunscreen type, just a color change. Loud, undeniable, and unmagical. I realized how ridiculous I sounded even as I said it. Mason didn't laugh. He was already thinking in constraints and contingencies. What I can do, he said slowly, is formulate a water-safe tint that activates in the presence of that sunscreen's particular ingredients under strong sunlight. It's more of a color trigger than a chemical reaction. Like those pH strips you used to use in high school biology, safe, temporary, dramatic. But you have to promise me two things. You'll let me test it thoroughly, and you'll not let anyone with sensitive skin be exposed without consent. No surprises beyond color. No skin irritation. No long-term staining. I promised. I promised things I hadn't even known I'd be comfortable, promising no permanent harm, no medical risk, and no escalation beyond humiliation and exposure. Mason arrived 3 days later, carrying a small case that looked like a travel kit for a very precise barber. He'd brought samples, safety data sheets, and a patient, mildly exasperated expression that said, "This is why we became scientists and not vigilantes." We set up in my garage because it was neutral territory, not a lab, not a crime scene. He talked me through options without ever giving me a recipe. What you want is selectivity, he explained, tapping a glossy sachet. Many luxury sunscreens use higher concentrations of physical blockers and certain stabilizers. We can use a harmless dye that binds temporarily to those stabilizers under UV exposure. The dye itself is used in pool testing, cosmetic demos, and theatrical makeup. It's formulated to rinse off with soap and won't penetrate the skin beyond surface staining. It fades in a day or two. That's important, humiliation, not injury. He placed a few drops into a clear beaker of pool water and added a dab of the same sunscreen. Karen always used the brand I'd painstakingly identified from the footage where she slathered on before diving. At first, nothing. Then, within minutes, the water shifted from perfect blue to a startling jewel-toned green. It was mesmerizing, like someone had flipped a switch in the color palette of reality. On a white cloth, introduced to the mixture, a temporary green tint bloomed vivid but shallow, exactly the theatrical effect Mason promised. We ran every control. Mason insisted on skin patch samples, silicone pads that replicated skin texture, clothing, swatches, sunglasses, lenses, even my white pool towel. The tint showed up only where the sunscreen was present. On bare silicone, it did nothing. On the fabric, it left a faint, easily washed line. Mason recorded every test, every measurement for his own conscience more than mine. Ethical clearance, he joked at one point, though we both knew he meant it. If you go forward, do not under any circumstances lie to the police about what this is. Be transparent, a harmless colorant activated by cosmetics. If Karen wants to make it a crime, let the investigation prove your case. I appreciated that line more than he knew. There is a delicate difference between planning someone's comeuppance and setting a trap that turns into legal peril. I wanted to stay on the right side of that line. I wanted proof, and Mason's tests gave me exactly that clean, reproducible proof that whatever spectacle I staged would be non-toxic, reversible, and indisputably tied to Karen's chosen sunscreen. We prepared the agent in a small, sealed container. Mason labeled it and handed me the data sheet. Store it cool, he said, like a priest passing a relic. Apply it as you would any pool additive, except in small, documented doses. Document everything: time, amount, weather. If this goes sideways, your best defense is your paperwork. My hands shook as I took the vial. That more than anything made it feel real. This wasn't revenge in the gutter brawl sense. It was revenge with paperwork, with lab notes, with witnesses in the form of time-stamped security footage. It was quiet, clever, and surgical. It would expose her, embarrass her, and leave me standing in the well-lit middle of it all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Karen's smug face dipping into blue water, and then unexpectedly vividly green. I imagined her shrieking the neighbors, peeking over fences, the HOA president scrambling for PR spin. I imagined the footage time-stamped, unedited, undeniable. But there were practicalities to settle. Timing mattered. Weather mattered. If it rained, the dye might dilute. If a neighbor called the cops before the show, I'd be questioned. Mason and I made a checklist that would have made a wedding planner proud: ideal sunny window pool, clarity-checked camera angles, verified bystander consent for non-participants. We'd invite none, and contingency plans for children or anyone with skin conditions. I would not spring this on the neighborhood without a safety net. There was also the moral calculus, an internal debate that kept me awake until dawn. Was humiliating someone the same as teaching them a lesson? Was public exposure cruelty? Even if what they did was cruel, I kept circling back to one thought. This was a woman who made a hobby of violation, who invaded a stranger's sanctuary, with friends who weaponized friendship and influence to rewrite the rules. There was a civic cost to that behavior beyond my personal hurt. If the world learned what she'd been doing, maybe fewer people would be gaslit into silence. At breakfast, I called one neighbor I trusted, Jim, a retired school teacher who'd been friendly when I moved in. I told him honestly, with none of the theatricality I was planning, with a friend who is a chemist, a harmless public reveal to prove trespassing. I asked him to be a witness to stand with me if things escalated. He hesitated, then said, "If you're sure it's safe and legal, do it." Somebody needed to tell the neighborhood what she's done. He promised to come by and keep watch. So the trap was set in more than one way. Mason had produced the colorant, my cameras were aligned, the HOA's indifference had given me the permission by default I needed, and a small, quiet alliance of neighbors was on notice, ready to watch. I felt less like I was plotting a petty revenge, and more like someone who'd finally decided to defend his house with everything at his disposal: intelligence, allies, and a bit of chemistry. For the first time since the hat-waving incident, excitement edged out fear. The stage was ready. All we needed now was an audience, and for Karen to swim. The vial was smaller than I imagined, about the size of a travel perfume sample, snug in Mason's palm, like a secret he was a little ashamed to carry. He handed it over with the kind of calm you get from people who've done things in labs that would make most folks nervous. "Label it," he said. "Keep the data sheet. Don't improvise. Start small. Document the time, the weather, the volume of water. If anything goes sideways, paperwork is your friend." His carefulness comforted me. It also made the plan feel official, like a surgical strike rather than a tantrum. I tucked the sealed container into a padded envelope and slid it into the cooler I kept for pool toys, the last place Karen would look. Then I cleaned the pool. There's an intimacy to pool maintenance that people who don't own pools don't get. You become precise with your movements, as if the water responds to ritual. I skimmed leaves, balanced chlorine levels, checked filters, and polished the tile until the rim caught the sun and winked. The water looked impossibly blue, the sort of blue you see in expensive travel brochures. It had to. The spectacle would be meaningless if the baseline wasn't perfect. Think a stage with immaculate lighting. Think a magician's cabinet before the trick. Everything had to be pristine so that the color change would read as impossible as undeniable. I documented everything Mason asked. Pool, volume, time of day, exact weather conditions, a photo of the sealed vial with the datasheet beside it. I set my cameras to high-res wide-angle mode and added a redundancy feed to my neighbor Jim's phone so he could stream what I couldn't watch. I video called him and walked him through the camera angles, one focused on the gate, one on the lounge chairs, one with a shallow focus on the pool itself. Jim, bless him, sounded thrilled and nervous in equal measure. Historic moment, he said. If we're wrong, we look like jerks. If we're right, we look like, I don't know, heroes vigilantes with taste. I laughed, but it was a brittle sound. I also left a written note for Mason: no children allowed. If anyone under 18 is present, call emergency services and neutralize immediately. He texted back 3 skull emojis and 1 thumbs up. His humor was the glue holding the plan together. The night before the operation, I couldn't sleep. I rehearsed everything mentally like it was a play I was about to open. I imagined Karen's entrance, the hat, the sunglasses, the precise way she'd flip her towel. I imagined the water's surface going from postcard blue to something so ridiculously green it would have the neighborhood app crashing from too many screenshots. I tried to prepare for the aftershocks in my head. The threats, the lawsuits, the angry entitled phone calls. Mason had insisted we keep the data sheet where any investigating officer could see it. If you have nothing to hide, he'd said, your transparency will be your armor. That sentence was a small, cold comfort. Saturday dawned, perfect, clear sky, a thin breeze, the thermometer a merciful 82 degrees. The kind of weather that invites confidence. My motion alerts were set to silent on my phone, but my neighbor Jim was on watch, and his number was set to a ringtone that could wake the dead. He sent 3 thumbs-up emojis at 9:18 a.m., the international signal for all systems go. I loaded the vial into a handheld dispenser, nothing technical, just a measured container Mason had provided, and walked out to the pool like a man going to Sunday Mass. I did not douse the pool with some theatrical dramatic flourish. Mason had emphasized restraint. Safety and legal defensibility were not just ethical niceties, they were practical defenses. I added a precisely measured amount he'd advised, and recorded the exact timestamp on my phone. Then, I swirled the water gently with the skimmer to disperse it. For a long, agonizing 5 minutes, nothing happened. The pool was the same crystalline blue I'd spent the morning loving. The quiet was loud. I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, and opened every feed. The 3 camera windows on my laptop were a testimony to modern paranoia: the gate, the chairs, the pool. I had the vial and the data sheet on the table beside me. I had a cold beer I didn't want and a lawn chair I didn't need. I felt ridiculous and righteous at the same time. Jim texted Sons hi. Gate open, I checked the feed. The gate was closed. Not yet, I typed back. Time stretches weirdly in moments like that. It's both compressed and elastic. Every creak of the fence becomes a clock. I replayed old footage as if revising a score, Karen applying sunblock, the smear of sunscreen on her forearm like armor. I remembered Mason's tests, how the tint only manifested when that particular sunscreen met the target dye under sunlight. Chemistry, as it turns out, has a petty sense of humor. Around 1:14 a.m., I heard a car door in the distance, muffled but distinct. I felt my stomach drop and my palms go clammy. Jim sent another message: movement, gate. I opened the camera feed faster than I knew I could. The gate swung inward, and there she was, silhouette framed against the sun like a cartoon villain taking her cue. Her hat was on sunglasses in place. Her beach bag swung over one shoulder. She paused on the threshold as if to take in the scene, then smiled that smile that had caused so many little domestic wars around the neighborhood. She sauntered forward, each step perfectly confident. She wasn't alone. 2 women followed her, laughing, one balancing a flamingo float like some sort of plastic trophy. They approached the lounge chairs and dropped their things with practiced authority. One of them pretended to check the water, peering at her reflection with mock innocence. Karen winked at the camera, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked directly into my eyes through the lens of my phone. It was the look of someone used to winning. She paused, as she always did, to slather on sunscreen. The ritual was almost theatrical, a slow, methodical rubbing into her arms and chest, that glossy coat of protection that smelled faintly of coconut and arrogance. For the first few minutes there was nothing. They chatted, they sipped. The sun glinted off the water and off the sequin strap of Karen's swimsuit. I felt the electricity of the moment, the rare kind that precedes either disaster or triumph. Then, slowly, almost like the start of a joke, a green bloom appeared along Karen's shoulder. It was small at first, like a smudge, but vivid, the color of crushed emeralds. Karen glanced down with a puzzled frown. Her friends laughed until they saw the green spreading across the surface, then across skin, then across the flamingo's plastic cheek. They shrieked. One of them slipped on the wet deck and fell, sending a spray of water and sunscreen into the air. Cameras caught everything. From my kitchen, watching through the feed, my heart was doing a peculiar little dance. It wasn't elation. It was relief, braided with shame and a strange guilty thrill. I saw Karen leap out of the pool, sputtering and swatting at her dripping arms, like a woman under attack by color. She was screaming half outrage, half bewilderment, and already true to form, she was filming herself. Her fingers found her phone with the speed of an instinctive storyteller. Look what they did to me. Help. Chemical attack, she yelled, bloodless and furious, as if the very idea of being embarrassed was an assault on civilization. I watched her face contort between genuine surprise and practiced performance. Her friends were panicking, their laughter turned to alarm. Neighbors peeked over fences. Jim had opened his garage door and was filming from a safe distance. The backyard filled with the sound of chaos, shoes, thudding water, sloshing, high-pitched, screaming, the distant revving of a lawnmower someone had turned on to cover what was happening, as if noise could blot out disgrace. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone and set it to record the feeds locally. Every camera timestamp stored with a file named and dated as Mason insisted. I made a terse note, 1147 a.m., 82 degrees Fahrenheit, clear sky vial batch 245A, applied at 1012 a.m. documented. It felt clinical and absurd to put those words down, but documentation was what would keep this from collapsing into mere rumor. I also felt something else, a small, unwelcome prick of empathy. Even the most entitled people have a moment where the mask slips and they are suddenly undeniably human. Karen's face flecked with green, staring at her own hands as if betrayed by her skin was not a cartoon in that second. She was a person who made calculated choices that had consequences. Perhaps that was the point. The neighbors gathered phones out, some scandalized, some delighted, a few, clearly savoring the spectacle like an open-air theater. The HOA president was not yet in sight. For a long moment, the suburban soundscape was a chorus of gasps and camera shutters. I sat very still at my kitchen table, the glow of the screen painting my face, the dull blue of someone who had pulled a curtain on a secret. That was when I realized there is a quiet, precise cruelty to consequence when it's aimed to reveal truth rather than punish. I had chosen to expose, not harm. I had chosen documentation, not vigilantism. I hoped, more than I'd admit, that the law and the community would be merciless in their own way. And on that strange, bright morning, as neighbors took sides and the internet's shadows began to stir, I felt a peculiar mixture of triumph and melancholy. I had set the trap. The trap had sprung. The waiting, it turned out, had been the worst part. The moment the color hit the world tilted just a fraction enough to feel theatrical. It wasn't an explosion of paint or a cartoonish splash. It was a slow, undeniable tide of green that crawled across skin and fabric like tidewater reclaiming a shoreline. 1 second, the pool was postcard blue. The next, emerald veins fanned across the surface, catching the sun and throwing back light like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. Karen was the first to notice. She had that routine down hat off sandals, discarded one exuberant cannonball to announce that she owned the afternoon. Her entry made that perfect little round of ripples, and then as she surfaced, her left forearm had a blot the color of a broken bottle. She blinked, puzzled, the laugh on her lips freezing into a puzzled frown. For 3 seconds, she looked at it like someone who'd found a stain on an heirloom shirt and thought with a small private horror about dry cleaning. And then it spread. Her face shifted. Confusion gave way to the pure, white-hot astonishment of someone who thinks rules simply don't apply to them and then discovers they do. She started splashing wildly, as if to rub the green off, but it only streaked further across her chest, up into her hairline, ghosting over the rim of her sunglasses. Her friends shrieked, half in sympathetic alarm, half in the sudden dizzy realization that their afternoon had taken a hard left into the absurd. The chaos that followed would have made a director salivate. One friend slipped on the wet decking and skidded into a plastic chair, sending a scatter of cups and sunscreen bottles like confetti. Another dove out and stamped at her arms with towel and hands, creating a rain of green droplets that flew in every direction. Someone started recording. Of course, someone started recording. This neighborhood records everything from suspicious porch lights to suspicious casseroles, and this was the motherlode. I watched through the camera feed, every pixel time-stamped, and felt a weird double heartbeat, a quiet satisfaction, and an intrusive ghastly empathy. The sight of someone's skin turning an unnatural color isn't pretty, even if that someone has been behaving like a small-town despot. For a beat, Karen looked like any shocked person who has realized they might be in real trouble, mouth open, eyes wide, hands trembling, as she tried to understand what had happened. She screamed instant and operatic. Not the high-curled scream of a child, but the breathy, righteous howl of someone who believes they are being wronged by the universe itself. "Oh my God, somebody help me, I'm being poisoned," she shrieked, waving her phone in the air, broadcasting live with the practiced urgency of a woman who had weaponized victimhood for years. Her performance was half panic, half PR. She held the camera up, angled just so, and delivered her lines. "They put something in the water. Chemical attack. Get the authorities." The irony was dense. She was simultaneously accusing me and admitting in front of thousands of scrolling viewers that she was in my backyard without permission. Neighbors started appearing along fence lines like birds drawn to a flash of color. Mr. Patel from 2 houses down peeked over as if watching a nature documentary. A teenage girl filmed from the porch in a loop of giggles and gasps. Jim took his position 2 houses over a safe distance, but within witness sightlines, phone in hand, to stream the raw camera feeds to me, and to record his own testimony. The gate had been closed, the timestamps were clean, the vial had been applied hours earlier, and documented by Mason. He kept his voice level as he whispered into his microphone, the sort of calm witness voice that made the whole thing feel less like a prank and more like an experiment somebody had finally stopped denying. Karen's screeching pivoted into rage as she realized the optics weren't going in her favor. She shouted accusations that ricocheted across the yard. "You'll pay for this. You'll regret it. I'll have you arrested." Her voice had the practiced cadence of someone who believed litigation was a cudgel. She pointed at me at the house, at the window where I sat like a man in a control room, and the phone in her hand transformed from weapon to altar. She was creating her narrative victim wronged at home, targeted by a neighbor. Only she was doing it in my house, on my cameras, on a phone that also recorded the exact moment she climbed through the gate, the shots of her applying sunscreen 5 minutes before the metadata that tucked every action into an immutable beta. Timeline. In the live feed, you could see her checking her phone, then looking up, then making that slow, certain march through the gate as if she were the protagonist in some suburban soap. The footage didn't lie. The footage sat there like a quiet, merciless juror. Someone misses. Alvarez from across the way brought out a garden hose and tried to rinse them off, but the green stuck for a little while, reminding everyone that embarrassment has a residue. There was a smell, too faint, an oddly chemical cleaning supply, bitter with a faint citrus, something the human nose registers as off, even if it isn't actually harmful. It made people wrinkle their noses and pull back, which in this neighborhood translated into the equivalent of applause. As the minutes ticked, the live video comments poured in a carnival of reactions. "Karen's going green," one user wrote. "Shrek's back," typed another. Someone stitched the footage into a looping meme before noon. Within an hour, the hashtag had spilled into the local community group, where half the neighborhood lived vicariously through other people's drama. Of course, the internet had opinions, some sympathetic, many gleeful, a small contingent angrily defensive on Karen's behalf. But the central fact in the footage was not opinion. She was on private property, she had keys, or at least access, and she had been filmed doing it. The police arrived 20 minutes after the initial chaos. They parked 2 cruisers down the block and walked up with measured boss-like steps. By the time they reached us, Karen was in full performance mode, tearful, indignant, pointing, accusing, and recording everything as evidence of an assault. The officers watched the live feed on my tablet, brows knitting, as they scrolled through the timestamps and camera angles. One of them, Officer Ruiz, who would later become a small, benevolent footnote in this story, didn't bother with the show. He asked calmly to see license and registration, and then more importantly to watch the security footage. We handed over everything. The officers watched in silence as Karen's narrative unraveled on Loopgate open at 1140. Karen enters at 1142, sunscreen application at 1144, color manifestation at 1147. It was all there. Her live stream, which had been racking up sympathetic comments, also showed her taking a phone selfie while in the pool and saying unguarded, "Look, we're at Tom's new place, exclusive access, huh?" That selfie shared with the community would be significant later. Karen's pleas for criminal charges were recorded by the officers and filed like any other complaint. The polite, practical detachment of the men and women in uniform made the whole thing feel smaller and larger at once. Small because what played out in suburban yards shouldn't require sirens, but large because the law's machinery was now involved, and everything I had documented would have to stand up to question. As the police took statements, the mood on the street teetered between giddy and solemn. People who had once smiled at Karen in the grocery aisle now avoided her eyes. A few slipped over fences to ask me if I was okay. Others simply watched phones out as if they were waiting for the final act. Standing there, watching my neighbors parade their curiosity and judgment, I felt the peculiar sensation of having removed a blindfold for an entire community. The green on Karen's elbows was ridiculous. The green on her face was humiliating. But the green also served as proof as theater, as a mirror held up to an entitlement that had been allowed to fester. At one point, Karen lunged toward me, finger wagging, eyes fierce, with something that felt like fear carved into rage. "You'll pay for this," she hissed. "I'll make sure you lose everything." She bent so close I could see the pattern of wrinkles at the corner of her mouth, a map of a person used to getting what she wanted. I already paid for everything, I said quietly. My house, my pool, my peace. You broke into my life. That's what you're being shown. It wasn't a grand moral statement, it was simply true. Officer Ruiz put a hand on Karen's shoulder to steady her and said in the voice of someone who has heard enough neighborhood melodrama for a career, "Ma'am, we'll take your statement. But we also have video showing you entering private property. This will all go on the report." She sputtered and stewed and threatened lawsuits and revenge, and as the officers led her a short distance away to get her contact information, she kept filming because when you're used to being a storyteller rather than a listener, you keep holding the camera. By the time the cars drove away, the sun had moved, the shadows were longer, and the smell of sunscreen still hung in the air like the residue of a bad dream. The camera feeds continued to record everything, neighbors' faces, the wet towels, the ruined serenity. Jim texted, "You did it." I sat back, feeling both vindicated and empty. The show was over, but the consequences were only beginning to ripple. By late afternoon, the internet had decided for us. What began as a backyard spectacle metastasized into 1,000 small judgments and a few huge, gleeful gashes of mockery. The clip of Karen, green streaks on her forearms, hair, wet mouth open, and the exact expression of someone caught between real surprise and an actor's practiced outrage landed in the local Facebook groups. Then the neighborhood chat. Then someone's TikTok remix. Within hours, the worst thing the HOA had ever produced was trending in our small corner of the web. At first, there were offers of sympathy for Karen. A handful of people posted in that performative way social media loves, "Hope she's okay and nobody deserves that." But the footage didn't read like victimhood. It read like chronology gate, opening sunscreen ritual 5 minutes before the plunge, her cheerful walk across the deck, the green bloom. She was in my backyard. She was on my cameras. She had filmed herself. Narrative had been strangled by metadata. That made the damage different. People didn't just see a humiliating moment, they saw context. If you wanted to be outraged for Karen, you had to ignore the receipts. Most people didn't. Most people loved receipts. The nicknames appeared within an hour. Someone with a savage sense of humor stitched Karen's face into a well-known movie poster and wrote The Incredible Sulk. Another turned her green arm into a looping gif with disco music. The neighborhood kids started chanting Shrek as they kicked soccer balls in a nearby driveway. A half-dozen memes boiled her down to a caricature entitled "Green and Forever Photogenic in Her Disgrace." Karen predictably turned to performance. She live-streamed from the driveway, a shaky, theatrical production where she alternated between tears and rage, pressing the camera into the faces of neighbors and bellowing for justice. "This man poisoned me," she cried into her phone, saturating the feed with breathless accusations and clipped close-ups that showed the green splotches and nothing else. Her followers, loyal, defensive, and as used to her narrativizing as a weather person is used to rain, commented with fury, "He's a monster. Call the police. Sue him." It was a classic counterpunch. If the world won't see you as a villain, manufacture a narrative where you're the injured party. The police had already done their part. Officer Ruiz and his partner had been patient, professional, and quietly thorough. They took statements from me, from Jim, from 2 neighbors who'd watched the footage, and from Karen herself. They cataloged the cameras, the timestamps, and the vials data sheet Mason had insisted I keep by the laptop. Officer Ruiz asked me to hand over everything. I did video files, timestamp logs, the vial label, and Mason's test records. 2 days later, I got a call from the detective assigned to the case. He had a measured voice and no appetite for internet theatrics. "We don't have evidence of chemical assault, sir," he said. "We do have evidence of trespassing. We also have a clear chain of footage that shows Miss Pemberton entering private property on multiple occasions. He used her full name, Pemberton, and the syllables sounded heavier than the casual Karen people hurled in comments. We'll ask the district attorney to review, but from what we've seen, you followed procedure, you documented, you preserved evidence, and you called the police promptly. It felt unreal to be praised in the language of bureaucracy. It was one thing to make a point. It was another to have the point validated by someone in a uniform reading from a file. Validation tastes like quiet coffee after a day of shouting. Karen's reaction escalated predictably into the legal theater she loved. She threatened lawsuits and live streams, the kind of hissed legalese that presumes a sympathetic judge and a gullible jury. She called the HOA board and demanded action. The HOA, which had been hermetic and protective of one of their own, found itself on the wrong side of an increasingly viral narrative. Public relations is a thin fabric. When pulled taut under the light of a scandal, it tears. Suddenly, the same men who had shrugged at my complaint were looking at their email with new urgency. That afternoon, the HOA president, Paul, called me. His voice was cautious, then defensive, then oddly apologetic. "We're going to hold an emergency meeting," he said. This blew up. "We'll form a committee to look into access keys and procedures. We'll reach out to Karen." The phrasing made it clear he wanted distance. Distance from the spectacle, distance from responsibility. The neighborhood grapevine hummed with gossip. Friends who had been neutral now stared at Karen in the grocery aisle, then quickly looked away. The memes did something structural to our community. People who had once tolerated Karen's small cruelties, petty fines, whispered rumors, questions about paint colors, began to compare notes. Over coffee, a woman named Rita admitted she'd had packages go missing whenever Karen had a party. A couple down the street mentioned HOA fees being diverted to community events they didn't recall approving. What had seemed like isolated incidents suddenly had pattern opportunism access influence. It's odd how humiliation can loosen lips. People talk when the world hands them a story that vindicates their small private grievances. The green footage became a pretext to air old hurts. The neighborhood chat, once a tame place for lost dogs and bake sale announcements, turned into a thread of confessions. Karen's pals rallied at first, defending her with gilded rationales. She's under stress. She was attacked. But then the receipts, photos of her at my pool messages about checking on Tom's place, a receipt for a duplicate key from the previous owner, began to pile up in that digital space like autumn leaves. They couldn't be raked into a neat pile and burned. Karen's attempts to control the narrative only fed the fire. Live videos became evidence of her trespass. Impassioned rants became clips people remixed into mockery. She hired a lawyer who sent me a cease and desist, not for chemical assault, but with the usual flourish implying damages and humiliation. Mason sent me a brief practical email. "Save everything. Don't engage. Let the evidence speak." I did. I saved every notification, every meme, every angry comment. I printed out time-stamped frames and tucked them into a folder that felt less like legal preparation and more like an archaeological dig of someone else's sense of entitlement. Through all that fury and digital chaos, I felt something complicated, not glee exactly, but relief, so acute it had edges. For months, I'd been made to feel petty, new, and unreasonable for insisting on my rights. The footage stripped that shame away. The proof didn't allow for the gaslighting I'd been subject to. It demanded accountability. But I also felt the humbling quiet of consequence. Karen was a person with flaws and hubris. She wasn't a cartoon. The green on her skin was temporary. The humiliation, though sharp, would dull and roll away for most. For her, the social cost was real. Friends drifting HOA committees, whispering phone calls unanswered. She lashed out and failed to command sympathy. The neighborhood, once complicit in small silences, suddenly found itself aligning behind deterrence. There were ugly nights, angry voicemail, a smashed flower pot on the porch that I hadn't heard anyone explain away, an anonymous text with a promise to make me pay. There were also small telling moments, a neighbor bringing over slices of cake and saying with tearful half-laughter we were wrong to look the other way. Jim, who watched the feed like a guardian owl, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You did the right thing. Not everyone would have had the restraint." I nodded, uncertain whether restraint or reckoning was the better virtue. As the days blurred, Karen retreated into a function I've seen before. In people who lose the social script they once wrote, she blamed others, then herself, then the world. She oscillated between apology videos and legal threats. The HOA, sensing the heat, moved to audit access keys and review its policies. Paul called a meeting to restore trust. The energy of the place shifted. People started locking gates not out of fear but out of principle. The memes faded as memes do, but the consequences didn't. Karen was quieter in the aisles now. People waved with distance. The green stain on a few photos remained as a grotesque watermark of entitlement, an image that would haunt PTA slideshows and PowerPoint pitches for weeks to come. I didn't dance in the street. I didn't throw a party. I sat by the pool at dusk that week with a glass of wine and watched the water reflect the sunset like it always did, blue, steady, unperforming. Justice, I discovered, was less a shout than a slow reordering of small things, a locked gate, an HOA that couldn't pretend anymore, neighbors who finally spoke up. The hum of cicadas filled the silence like a small, indifferent applause. When I went to bed that night, I felt tired in a different way, less hunted and more settled. The neighborhood had shifted. The scales hadn't been perfectly balanced, but they'd tipped. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. 2 days later, the calm I'd been savoring broke with a knock on my door. It was early morning, the kind of hour where bad news tends to arrive. Through the peephole, I saw 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch. One of them, Officer Ruiz, the same man who had witnessed the chaos, offered a tired smile that said, "We're doing this again, huh, morning Mr. Harding," he said. "We'd like to ask you to come down to the station. Miss Pemberton's filed an official complaint." I sighed, already expecting it. "Let me guess, attempted chemical assault." He nodded. "That's the wording, yes. We just need to clear it up. Shouldn't take long." At the precinct, I sat across from a detective who looked like he'd been forced to take this case only because it had gone viral. He asked all the routine questions: what was in the water, where I got it, whether I intended harm. I handed over the datasheet Mason had printed, the product's material safety datasheet, and copies of the emails where we discussed concentration levels and safety standards. I also provided the USB with every camera angle, including the clips where Karen entered the yard repeatedly without permission. When he finished watching, the detective exhaled long and low. "So he said this, chemical is actually a cosmetic dye that reacts with sunscreen." "Yes," I said. "It's used in demo kits for beauty schools. Non-toxic washes off in a day or two. The only difference is she wasn't supposed to be there." He looked over the paperwork again, tapping his pen on the table. "You documented every step." "That's rare. I've been trained," I said. "In this neighborhood, documentation is survival." He chuckled and stood. "Well, congratulations, Mr. Harding. You've officially wasted an hour of my life, but you also happen to be completely in the clear. Miss Pemberton's complaint won't go anywhere. We'll file a report, but she's got bigger problems, like what I asked." He leaned back, half grinning, "like trespassing charges. And possibly obstruction, if she keeps trying to spin this story online." By noon, the whole thing was over. I wasn't arrested, questioned further, or fined. Karen, on the other hand, walked herself right into a legal buzzsaw. The footage had become more than viral content. It was now evidence. Every timestamp proved she entered my property knowingly and without consent. More importantly, the HOA's emails, which surfaced in the public outcry, revealed that she'd been warned multiple times by Paul and other board members to stop accessing private lots. She had ignored all of them. When the police wrapped their investigation, the statement was short and surgical. No chemical substances of harmful nature were found. No intent to injure. The alleged victim, Miss Pemberton, trespassed on private property. Case closed. But of course, nothing is ever really closed in an HOA neighborhood. By that evening, people were talking again, but not about the dye. They were talking about the audit. Turns out, when the HOA called an emergency meeting to address the community incident, they stumbled onto something else entirely: missing funds, unapproved expenses, thousands of dollars earmarked for community improvement projects that never happened. And guess whose name appeared next to most of those transactions? Karen's. The treasurer's position came with access to the HOA's discretionary account, and for years she'd been quietly padding invoices and redirecting funds to maintenance contracts that didn't exist. She'd gotten away with it because nobody dared question her, but the green fiasco broke her spell. Suddenly Paul, that spineless president who once defended her, was forced to open the books to calm public outrage. And when he did, the numbers glowed brighter than Karen's skin had. Within a week, the audit results leaked. Paul resigned, claiming health reasons. Karen's lawyer tried to hush the scandal, but the bank statements spoke for themselves. $60,000, unaccounted for. A handful of fake invoices written to shell contractors that led nowhere. The HOA board dissolved pending a county investigation. Karen was suspended indefinitely. When the police returned to her house, it wasn't for a pool dye complaint, it was for embezzlement. They didn't haul her off in handcuffs that day, but the site was close enough. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee watching, as she argued with a detective, her voice hoarse from weeks of denial. The green had finally faded from her skin, but the bitterness in her eyes hadn't. She saw me, of course. She always saw me. And before she turned away, she shouted across the street, "You think you won, you think this is over." I took a sip of coffee. "It is for me." That week was strange. The neighborhood moved in slow motion, like everyone was adjusting to a new gravity. The HOA sign by the clubhouse was taken down. The bulletin board that once held community reminders now held photocopies of the audit report. People who had avoided eye contact for months now waved at me across lawns. I became that guy, the man who stood up to Karen. Jim joked one night, "You didn't just stop her from swimming, you drained the swamp." He wasn't wrong. A few weeks later, restitution orders came down, $8, 500 inches damages to me for property interference and legal costs, 12 months probation for Karen, and a restraining order keeping her 500 feet away from my property. The state also ordered her to pay restitution to the HOA for the misused funds. When the order arrived, I sat at my kitchen table reading it twice, the legalese strangely soothing. Words like plaintiff, defendant, and restitution have a rhythm that feels like justice in bureaucratic form. Mason called later that night to check in. "She's still green?" he asked, half laughing. "Only in envy," I said. He snorted. "I told you chemistry always delivers poetic results." When the laughter faded, I found myself quiet. "You know," I said, "I didn't expect this to end the way it did. I just wanted peace." Mason's tone softened. "Peace and justice aren't opposites, Tom. Sometimes peace only happens because you make a little noise first." That line stuck with me. Because when the noise died, when the HOA leadership resigned and the gossip dried up, there was peace. A clean, heavy peace, the kind that feels earned. Weeks passed. The pool returned to being just a pool. The water was still deep blue again, silent except for the occasional ripple when the wind brushed it. Every weekend I'd pour myself a drink, sit on the deck, and stare at the reflection of the fence, the same fence that once felt like a battlefield. Neighbors came by occasionally, still curious. "So what's it like?" one asked. Finally, being left alone, I smiled. Expensive, but worth it. Karen's house went on the market not long after. A for sale sign appeared in her yard like a tombstone, marking the end of a very loud chapter. No one said goodbye. The new owners, a quiet couple with 2 kids, moved in without fuss. They waved politely and never once mentioned the incident. Sometimes I caught glimpses of her driving through the neighborhood, her white SUV creeping past like a ghost refusing to rest. But she never stopped, never looked my way for more than a second. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she still thought herself a victim. Either way, she was finally silent. I can't lie, there was satisfaction in knowing she'd been held accountable, but it wasn't the cartoonish triumph people online imagined. It was quieter, lonelier. Justice, I realize, isn't cinematic, it's procedural. It arrives in paper envelopes, not fireworks. One evening, about a month after the case closed, I found myself sitting by the pool again, sunset reflecting off the calm surface. I thought about how easily something perfect can become chaos, how one act of arrogance can unravel years of reputation, and how one small decision to record, to document, to stand firm can change everything. Karen had tried to weaponize attention, but in the end, attention became her undoing. She wanted to be the star. She ended up the cautionary tale. As the sky shifted from orange to violet, I raised my glass and whispered to the still water, to boundaries, and to knowing when to enforce them. The ripples caught the light, and for a fleeting second, it almost looked like the water was glowing again. Not green this time, but gold. If this story taught me anything, it's that peace isn't given, it's protected. When someone crosses a line, even a small one, they're testing whether you'll redraw it or let it blur. Karen thought she could rewrite ownership through arrogance, but facts, patience, and proof outlast drama every single time. Sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting, fighting, or stooping to their level, it's letting truth do the talking. Document everything. Stay calm. Let their own actions testify against them. In the end, the green wasn't punishment. It was a mirror, a reflection of the entitlement she carried everywhere she went. For me, it was proof that justice can be clever, quiet, and still perfectly fair. So if you've ever been pushed, mocked, or invaded by a Karen in your own life, remember this: you don't need to destroy them, just expose them. Truth glows brighter than any dye. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe karma doesn't miss a beat. Because here in the HOA, justice isn't blind, it's color-coded.